Um, our first reading this morning is another Joy Harjo poem. You can probably tell I've been reading a lot of Joy Harjo, who, again, if you don't know the name, she's our poet laureate, the first indigenous poet laureate that we've had. She's of the Muskok people. This is another poem, her recent book of poems from 2019, I believe, An American Sunrise, deals with a lot of the ongoing reverberations of her people's land being occupied, the indigenous experience of Europeans. It also deals with lots of questions of mortality. And so there are, well, one of the poem we use for our opening sentences is one of those mortality poems. The poem that we will have for our first reading is another of those. It's a poem called First Morning, and it's dedicated to her friend Shan Goshorn after she had died. And there is actually a video of Joy Harjo offering this at a reading. So I thought we could hear it in her own voice and own words as she does some setup to the poem and then offers the poem for us.
And we're all here for just a little time. You may not think that when you're young, but as you get older, I know that there's some kind of equation that will tell you how time shifts, in relationship to your age. Because we all remember being very young and how one day was an eternity. Being called in from the eternity of outside as a little kid from playing was, destroying. It was, horrible. And nowadays and it gets faster and faster. But life is still precious all the way. And in that equation, you would also see that the story doesn't begin when you're born. It begins way before your birth. And it doesn't end when you leave. It just keeps going. And I think when you come into this world, you know that. When you spend time with newborns, they come in, they still have the whole story. They still remember the story. And they will tell you that story. And I've noticed that usually somebody comes in with every child. It's usually somebody, your relatives, somebody who's come in as a caretaker. And when we leave, they're there to greet us. And the story continues. For Shan, first morning. This is the first morning we are without you on earth. The sun greeted us after a week of rain in your eastern green and mountain homelands. Plants are fed, the river restored, and you have been woven into a path of embracing stars of all colors, now free of the suffering that shapes us here. We all learn to let go, like learning how to walk when we first arrive here. All those you thought you lost now circle you, and you are free of pain and heartbreak. Don't look back, keep going. We will carry your memory here until we join you in just a little while, in one blink of star time.
Our Bible reading this morning is one of the assigned lessons, this one from the book of Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 25, verses 6 through 9. This is one that gets read at funerals sometimes. It says, "On this mountain, the Lord of hosts will prepare for all peoples a banquet of rich food, a banquet of fine wines, food rich and succulent and fine aged wines. On this mountain, God will remove the mourning veil covering all peoples, the shroud covering all nations, destroying all death forever. God will wipe away the tears from every cheek and will take away the shame of God's people on earth, wherever they live. God has spoken. On that day, it will be said, this is our God. This is the one for whose liberation we waited. God is the one in whom we hoped. Let us be glad and exult in our deliverance." This is God's good news. This morning's Bible reading captures a vision of people who were well acquainted with suffering. It's from a little section of the relatively large book of Isaiah that scholars refer to as Isaiah's apocalypse. It just kind of pops up amid some of the gloom and doom. It doesn't seem directly related to the particular context where it is or to any of the sections around it. But it's very clearly a product of people who had suffered violence and exile at the hands of neighboring empires. And it's meant as a word of hope, a balm for people living inside a legacy of trauma and who had endured harsh deprivation and loss. The image of a feast, a multinational, multi-ethnic feast at that, a gathering where loss is restored, where trauma is repaired, where body and soul alike are fed. It speaks powerfully to the hopes of wounded communities. As a reading for All Saints Sunday, it also offers us a handy question. Whose table would you like to sit at that feast? For folks who know me long enough, know what my answer is going to be. With the group of us who are outside in the back, I said, if you know me well, you know my answer is going to be, and Linda said without missing a beat, John Coltrane, which is true. Every single time it's going to be John Coltrane, but I want to go a little bit beyond my obvious answer this morning. Even though Coltrane was one of the most innovative and influential musicians of his day, and even though he accomplished that while also staying so rooted to his humanity that he was known to do things like take tickets at the door to give the doorman a break at the club. And sometimes he'd donate his share of ticket charges to make sure that club employees got paid. That's not even to mention that the newly released A Love Supreme live in Seattle had me weeping ecstatic tears a week ago. So, okay, I guess I just gave John Coltrane as my answer again. But I'm also thinking of Pauli Murray. She died in 1985. But I never heard of her until Linda posted about a recent documentary on her life. My Name is Pauli Murray. You can stream that on Amazon and it will be worth the 93-minute investment of your time. Just one story from that for this morning. I'm not going to replay the whole hour and a half. How in 1940, she and her friend Adeline Mack McBean rode a bus from New York to Virginia to visit her mom for Easter. As was common at the time, it was Jim Crow America. Once the bus crossed the Mason-Dixon line, Black passengers were expected to move to the back. Murray described it this way. She said, "The bus was the quintessence of the segregation evil. The intimacy of the bus interior permitted the public humiliation of Black people to be carried out in the presence of the privileged white spectators who witnessed our shame in silence or indifference. And once their bus crossed into Virginia, more white people boarded and many of the Black passengers moved to the rear out of habit. And the driver told Pauli and Mac that they needed to move back as well, but one of the seats where the driver told them to go was broken. And so they refused. And the bus driver dug in. We've heard this story before, haven't we? Somebody not moving to the back of the bus and the bus driver refusing to move and then calling the police. And this bus driver called the police who came and arrested them. Murray reached out to the NAACP. She wanted to be part of a court case that would challenge the legality of bus segregation, but it didn't work out that way in 1940. The judge saw what was going on and so didn't even bring up segregation in the trial, but just charged them with disturbing the peace. But the experience gave Pauli Murray her first taste of working with highly accomplished lawyers in pursuit of civil rights. Thurgood Marshall was one of the people on her legal team. It was one step toward a remarkable history in which Murray would become a civil rights activist, a human rights activist, a lawyer, a women's rights activist, and the first Black woman to be ordained as an Episcopal priest in the first year that the Episcopal Church ordained women. I should mention that I've been speaking about her using she, her pronouns, because that's what most scholars use. And those are the pronouns that a lot of the folks in the film use. But Murray was also gender non-binary, a trailblazer every which way you look. There's a lot of story to learn in that documentary, but I name the bus story because it happened 15 years before Rosa Parks jump-started a movement with her own refusal to give up her seat. On this All Saints Sunday, it reminds me that our giants stand on the shoulders of giants. Nobody comes out of nowhere. The writer of the biblical book of Hebrews said that we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. It's a classic reference point on All Saints Sunday. And Pauli Murray's story reminds me at least, that the cloud of witnesses holds names we should have heard long before most of us ever did. So I definitely want to sit at Pauli Murray's table in that apocalyptic feast. Maybe Marie Wilcox will be sitting there too. Marie Wilcox is among the saints who entered that great cloud of witnesses this year. She was 87 years old when she died this past September the 25th. She was a member of the Wukchumni tribe, which is one of several indigenous groups in California's central San Joaquin Valley, and they come under the broad umbrella of the Yokuts people. But unlike other Yokuts tribes, the Wukchumni don't have federal status, which means that they don't have the same resources to preserve their culture that some other tribes have. Marie Wilcox spent a large chunk of her 87 years working at a fruit packing house. She was keenly aware of her status as the last fluent speaker of the Wukchumni language. And so she got to work and spent more than 20 years of her life putting together a dictionary of the language and giving language lessons at a career development center. She got the dictionary copyrighted before she died, and now her family is looking for someone to publish it. In 2014, the New York Times made a short documentary about her that showed her hard at work typing Wukchumni words and stories into an old computer at her home. She said, in that documentary, she said, "See, I'm uncertain about my language and who wants to keep it alive, just a few. It's sad. It just seems weird that I'm the last one. I don't know, it'll just be gone one of these days, maybe, I don't know." It's probably too early to tell how long the Wukchumni language will last. Marie Wilcox was once its last fluent speaker, but it did not die out with her in September. There are at least 3 fluent speakers now living thanks to her dedication, and the language classes at the Career Development Center continue without her. So if there is an apocalyptic feast where people come from every nation and are gathered around a meal of rich food and rich wine, I hope that Marie Wilcox is at Pauli Murray's table, and I hope that I can sit there too, or at least come around to refill the wine glasses. I won't say anything, I just want to listen. But this isn't just a day for dinner party questions, as fun and as fascinating as they can be. All Saints Sunday is a day to remember that we all carry a legacy. Each one of us, for better and for worse. We hold within us the people we came from, the people who shaped us, the people who nurtured us, people who hurt us, people whose memory touches our shame reflex, people who we think of with pride, the ancestors we were given and the ancestors we choose. It's a day that invites us to step into the ever-moving current of life, to notice and name who has carried us to this point, to remember that we also will dissolve into the flow, to name our grief and our gratitude. One source that does that really well is Sarah Freilig's poem, Wondrous, which I encountered only recently. It gave me goosebumps the first time that I read it, so I figured it was worth sharing in church. She writes about just an everyday experience, the experience of being stuck in traffic, but in a way that took her to somewhere else. This is what she writes. I'm driving home from school when the radio talk turns to E.B. White, his birthday, and I exit the here and now of the freeway at rush hour, travel back into the past where my mother is reading to my sister and me the part about Charlotte laying her eggs and dying. And though this is the 5th time Charlotte has died, my mother is crying again. And we're laughing at her because we know nothing of loss and its sad math, how every subtraction is exponential, how each grief multiplies the one preceding it, how the author tried 17 times to record the words, "She died alone," without crying. 17 takes and a short walk during which he called himself ridiculous, a grown man crying for a spider he'd spun out of the silk thread of invention. Wondrous how those words would come back and make him cry. And yes, wondrous to hear my mother's voice 10 years after the day she died, the catch, the rasp, the gathering up before she could say to us, "I'm okay." I love what she does in this poem. It is an accurate naming of grief. Every subtraction is exponential, and each grief multiplies the one preceding it. But this is also a catalog of gratitude, a naming of ancestors, both given and chosen. She's naming saints, her mother, yes, but also the author of a beloved children's book. In naming this moment of childhood innocence, she is also tracing the ripples from the deeper waters of life that intersected to make it possible. E.B. White and her mother in a communion of tears brought by an imagined spider who represents all human loss. She names her grief, but she ends ultimately in gratitude and wonder, offering to us, her readers, this tender, ragged moment that conjures E.B. White and her mother into our own imaginations. The dead are brought back to life in her internal world and through her into the world of any of us who read the poem and are moved, and life flows on. Perhaps our acts of memory are one way in which that apocalyptic feast Isaiah imagined becomes real. To name is to invoke, to stand in the presence of those who have shaped us, who have shaped our world. To name is to bring to mind people in all their complexity and to offer ourselves as the holders of memory. We are a land in which they live. So All Saints Sunday invites us to name. I name people who died this year who were part of this congregation or who were part of people who are part of this congregation. I name Willie Mae Hayes, who is Molly Davis's grandmother. Andy Lewis, who is Gracie Lewis's father. Joe Palucci, who was Dora's father, Paul Haynes, Cassie's father, Lynn Galesian, Lori Tennant. And who would you name this morning? I would invite you in this time to come off mute. We'll also later at the end of the sermon, we'll hear another piece that Kyoko has sent, and you can also put names into chat if you would like. If you've got pictures of folks, you can hold them to the camera. But in this moment, I invite you, if you would like to come off mute, to name your saints, the people you invoke, the people that you want us to hold.
I name my brother, Don Anderson.
Now, I've been asked to name Engracia Figueroa, who was an advocate for people with disabilities, and to name Ovid's friends Lynn and LL.
I'll name Dan Guest raised this morning that his uncle Vernon died just this past week on All Saints Day. So Vernon Guest.
So we stand as the holders of memory. We are a land in which they live. We name them all that we might put in chat in a moment. Hold them together. This moment of naming, this moment of memory can be an apocalyptic feast where we join Polly Murray and Marie Wilcox and John Coltrane, E.B. White and Sarah Freilig's mother, and Andy, Joe, Willie Mae, Paul, Lynn, Lori, Vernon, where we can say to them, along with Joy Harjo, we will carry your memory here until we join you in just a little while, in one blink of star time. This is God's good news. Amen. And Ian is going to put on the piece of music, Kyoko Sena's